On May 5, 2021, in the middle of the Yellow Sea, a Chinese passenger ship was making its journey from the port city of Dalian toward Yantai. When the vessel was only about 11.5 miles from its destination, the captain was at the helm in the bridge when he suddenly received an urgent alert. A passenger had fallen overboard. Immediately, the captain ordered an emergency stop. Crew members heard the alarm and rushed toward the deck where the incident had occurred to begin rescue operations. At the scene, a man named Lee, the one who had reported the person overboard, was in a state of extreme emotional distress and panic. He kept pounding the ship's railing with his hands, screaming desperately, "Stop! Stop! Someone go save her!" His cries echoed across the deck, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. In his frenzy, Lee even made several attempts to climb over the railing as if to jump in and save his wife himself, forcing crew members to restrain him. Through questioning the husband, the crew determined that the passenger who had fallen overboard was his wife, a woman named Li Muhuan, who had been wearing a white long-sleeved jacket at the time of the incident. In the vast expanse of the open sea, searching for someone who has fallen into the water is like finding a needle in a haystack. Ocean currents can carry a victim far from their original position. However, fortunately, weather conditions that day were quite favorable. Clear skies, relatively calm waters, and good visibility, all factors that increased hope for the search and rescue operation. After approximately 45 minutes of searching the surrounding waters, a crew member suddenly spotted a white object floating in the distance. The passenger ship immediately adjusted course and quickly approached the location. When they got close enough to see clearly, they confirmed it was indeed the woman who had fallen overboard. Rescue personnel immediately threw a life buoy with a location marker into the water to assist her. But by this point, Muhuan had completely lost consciousness. The difficulty now was that due to the passenger ship's large size and deep draft, it couldn't maneuver flexibly or get close enough to directly retrieve her from the water. The crew could only maintain their position nearby and wait for the specialized rescue vessel from the Maritime Authority to arrive. About 10 minutes later, the professional rescue team finally reached the scene and quickly pulled Muhuan from the water. Tragically, when she was recovered, there were no longer any signs of life. The passenger ship continued its scheduled journey toward Yantai port, but in the captain's mind, a seed of doubt had begun to grow. He started thinking more carefully about the circumstances of the incident. The location where Muhuan had fallen overboard was a small platform on Deck 7, used for storing lifeboats. This was not an area meant for passengers to access. The side facing the open sea had no protective railing at all, while the interior side had a barrier with a conspicuous red warning sign that read, "Passengers stop here, no climbing." Everything indicated this was clearly a dangerous area, off limits to unauthorized personnel. So the question arose, knowing full well this was such a risky location, why had this couple deliberately entered it? With these questions in mind, the captain decided to ask Lee for details about how Muhuan had fallen overboard. Lee explained that his wife had long dreamed of taking a sea voyage to admire the vast ocean. However, after boarding the ship, they discovered a problem. Because his wife was rather short, when standing at the normal observation areas on the ship, her view was mostly blocked by the railings, preventing her from enjoying the sea view as she had hoped. For this reason, he had recklessly taken his wife to that dangerous area where no railings blocked the view, so she could freely admire the sea. He never expected this decision would lead to such a tragic accident. As he recounted this, Lee appeared deeply distressed and blamed himself. After the ship docked, the captain decided to extract all footage from the surveillance camera system from the time of Muhuan's fall, hoping to shed light on what had actually happened. However, upon careful examination of the videos, he discovered that due to the lifeboats mounted on the upper level creating an obstruction, the small platform where the incident occurred fell precisely in the camera's blind spot. The camera angle simply couldn't cover this area. As a result, the video only captured Muhuan rushing out from the deck and falling into the sea. But what had happened on that small platform in the moments before remained completely unrecorded. This discovery made the captain even more suspicious, raising many unanswered questions in his mind. He knew well that this passenger ship was equipped with a fairly modern security system with nearly 200 surveillance cameras of various sizes, a network that covered almost all public areas on the vessel. With such dense camera coverage, it would be very difficult for any blind spots to exist. So why did the incident happen to occur in one of the rare few blind spots in the entire camera system? Was this mere coincidence, or had someone deliberately chosen this location? Could this seemingly accidental fall overboard actually conceal some other secrets? According to police regulations, all cases involving someone falling into water must be handled as potential criminal cases until the cause is investigated and clarified. They cannot hastily be concluded as accidents or suicides. That afternoon, after 6 p.m., the passenger ship finally docked at Yantai port. The victim's body was taken off the ship and temporarily transferred to the local funeral home for preservation, pending further investigation. Since the incident occurred in waters under Dalian's jurisdiction, police from the Maritime Transportation Division of the Dalian Public Security Bureau were notified and immediately dispatched officers to Yantai that very night to coordinate handling of the case. The next morning, Yantai police began interrogating Lee to better understand the circumstances of the incident and his relationship with the victim. During this questioning, investigators gradually discovered numerous suspicious points about Lee. Lee stated that he currently ran a small restaurant in Shanghai to make a living, and Mu Huan was an employee working at his establishment. The two had met through work, gradually developed feelings for each other, and had officially registered their marriage about half a year ago. However, due to their previous circumstances, the couple's household registrations were still in two different locations. Lee said he was planning to transfer his wife's registration to his hometown for convenience in daily life and future administrative procedures. For this reason, before the tragic incident, he had driven his wife from Shanghai to Liaoning province to complete the registration transfer procedures. On the way back to Shanghai, his wife suddenly expressed that she had never in her life had the opportunity to take a sea voyage to view the ocean. This was something she had long wished for and really wanted to experience just once. Indulging his wife's wish, Lee took her aboard the passenger ship, departing from Dalian to Yantai. Who could have known that the first sea voyage of her life would also be her last? But what puzzled investigators was that throughout the 5-hour intense interrogation, Lee's behavioral expressions were completely inconsistent with the image of a husband who had just lost his wife in such tragic circumstances as he described. First, Lee's emotions were excessively calm, one might even say strangely cold. He showed none of the agitation or overwhelming grief that family members of victims typically display in similar situations. Lee sat there with a composed expression, answering questions unhurriedly as if recounting events about a stranger. Moreover, he made no mention of or showed any concern about compensation from the shipping company, something most victims' families focus on and want to clarify from the very beginning in accident cases. Particularly notable was that when asked about his emotional experiences and shared memories with his wife, Lee's answers seemed bland. The examples he gave about their married life sounded superficial, lacking detail, more like temporary fabrications than actual recollections of real memories. When trying to remember the past, his narrative was disjointed, incoherent, occasionally pausing to bow his head and sigh as if trying to think of something to say next. Overall, all his expressions carried an air of forced awkwardness and deliberate acting rather than genuine natural emotions. Second, Lee repeatedly and proactively expressed his hope that police could quickly issue a death certificate for his wife. He explained that after the accident, he was so grief-stricken he couldn't swallow anything. Since then, he had only managed to drink a single bowl of 8 treasure congee to sustain himself. He promised to cooperate fully with whatever the police asked, only hoping all procedures could be completed as quickly as possible so his wife could rest in peace. He added that he didn't want his wife's body to just lie in the freezer at the funeral home like that. It sounded so pitiful. Lai explained that according to customs in his hometown, the deceased must be cremated within 3 days. Any longer would be bad for the departed soul. Although these words sounded reasonable on the surface, this abnormally rushed behavior made police feel something was very wrong. Normally, even if a victim's family wants to handle funeral arrangements quickly, they would prioritize clarifying the cause of their loved one's death first. No one would push so urgently for a death certificate when nothing had been investigated yet. Carrying these doubts, police decided to collect all surveillance videos from the passenger ship on the day of the incident for more thorough analysis. They sat watching all footage showing the appearance of the Lee couple repeatedly, from when they boarded until just before the incident occurred. After carefully observing every small detail, investigators finally identified where that feeling of wrongness came from. As it turned out, the way the two interacted on the ship was completely unlike a normal couple with genuine feelings for each other. Not only that, but Lee's own behavior throughout that day also contained many suspicious points. The timestamp on the surveillance camera showed May 5th at 11:35 a.m. when the Lee couple stepped out of their cabin and began strolling on the ship's observation deck for about 15 minutes. The husband and wife always walked single file, one in front and one behind, maintaining a certain distance from each other with virtually no physical contact, no hand-holding, arm around shoulders, or even simply walking side by side. This was very unusual for a couple who had only been married for half a year. During that stroll, it was clear that Mu Huan, experiencing her first sea voyage, appeared extremely excited and delighted. She kept looking around, her face radiant, and repeatedly wanted to take photos with her husband to preserve beautiful memories of the trip. However, Lee appeared resistant and cold toward his wife's enthusiasm. Whenever she suggested taking photos together, he either refused outright or only reluctantly cooperated in a perfunctory manner, his face always bearing the expression of someone weighed down by heavy thoughts. Furthermore, investigators noticed that the two were dressed very differently, showing a stark disparity. Lee wore a well-tailored, elegant suit, his hairstyle neatly groomed, clearly someone who paid great attention to his external image and knew how to take care of his appearance. Meanwhile, Mu Huan was dressed rather casually and simply, her clothes unremarkable and not carefully chosen. When the two stood together, they seemed to belong to two completely different worlds, looking nothing like a well-matched married couple. However, the marriage certificate that police had collected showed they had officially registered their marriage on October 30th, 2020, nearly half a year before the incident. At the time of marriage, Lee was 46 years old while Mu Huan was 44, both already middle-aged. Yet this state of being physically together but emotionally miles apart completely contradicted what Lee had stated during interrogation about their harmonious, loving marriage. At 4:26 p.m., the camera recorded Lee stepping out of the cabin alone, without his wife. He walked directly to the Deck 7 area, the very place where Mu Huan would later fall overboard. At the railing in front of the lifeboats, Lee exhibited very strange behavior. He paced back and forth around that area for nearly 20 minutes, during which he repeatedly pushed and pulled on the railing as if testing its sturdiness or measuring something. Only after completing this did he return to the cabin. Yet less than a few minutes later, he reappeared, this time leading Mu Huan to that same area. Together, the two opened the barrier gate with the warning sign, then proceeded deep inside toward the outermost section of the lifeboat storage area. Shortly after entering, both disappeared from the screen, entering the camera's blind spot. What appeared on camera next was Mu Huan rushing out from the deck and falling into the sea. Through careful research and analysis, police discovered something noteworthy. To completely avoid the camera's view at that location, a person would have to squat down and hide behind the lifeboats. Simply standing up or moving out of that hiding position would immediately bring them into the camera's view. Could it really be true that the couple was squatting there simply to admire the sea and take photos as Lee had claimed? How could one comfortably enjoy scenery or take nice photos while squatting in such a position? Combined with Lee's abnormal behavior throughout the earlier interrogation, his cold lack of emotion, his rush to cremate his wife, and his distant treatment of her on the ship, police grew increasingly suspicious that this was not simply an unfortunate accident of falling overboard. Lee was a major suspect, and all evidence seemed to point in that direction. Those 20 minutes he had spent pacing alone on the deck were very likely the time he was contemplating, calculating, and planning how to attack his wife. However, at this point, the surveillance footage collected could only prove that the Lee couple lacked safety awareness, had opened the barrier gate into a restricted area on their own, and that an accident then occurred. The video didn't capture what happened inside the blind spot, so legally there still wasn't enough evidence to charge Lee. What police most needed to clarify was exactly what Lee had done during the time the two were in the camera's blind spot. To get an answer to this question, the only way was to conduct an autopsy on Mu Huan's body to determine the precise cause of death. When police made the request for an autopsy, unsurprisingly, they encountered extremely strong opposition from Lee. He cited every possible reason to obstruct it, wanting to keep his wife's body intact, hometown customs not allowing it, wanting his wife to rest in peace soon. Lee's adamant opposition only made police more suspicious. However, with the arrival of Mo Huan's relatives from her hometown, Lee's determined opposition became futile. Under patient explanation and persuasion from police about the importance of clarifying the truth, Mo Huan's father and older brother finally agreed to proceed with the autopsy to determine the true nature of the case. And from these family members, police gathered some completely unexpected information. Mo Huan's father told police that his daughter had previously gone through 2 failed marriages and had 2 children from those previous marriages. After her second divorce, life became difficult, and to earn money to support her family and care for her children, she had left her hometown alone to find work in Shanghai. What surprised police even more was that none of Mo Huan's family knew of Lee's existence. They had no idea their daughter had remarried for the 3rd time. Mo Huan had never mentioned this man to her family, had never brought him home to meet them, and had never announced the marriage. Additionally, the family had never heard her say she wanted to take a sea voyage to enjoy the scenery, as Lee had claimed. However, a friend named Zhu, who had accompanied Mo Huan's brother to Yantai, happened to know Lee. Zhu also worked and lived in Shanghai, and he was the one who had introduced Mo Huan to work as a server at Lee's restaurant in the first place. When he heard that the two had registered their marriage, Zhu was also extremely surprised and confused, because from what he had observed during Mo Huan's time working at the restaurant, the two had a purely ordinary employer-employee relationship with no signs of any special romantic feelings. Zhu explained further that Lee was originally a distinguished graduate from a prestigious university with education and a certain social standing. For many years he had remained single, but not because no one pursued him. There was no shortage of women interested in him. Meanwhile, Mo Huan was just an ordinary-looking woman with no degrees or higher education, and she had 2 children from 2 previous marriages. By any measure, the two were completely mismatched. No matter how he thought about it, Zhu couldn't imagine why someone like Lee would choose to marry Mo Huan. The testimony from Mo Huan's father and brother, combined with the information provided by Zhu, made police increasingly certain that this marriage concealed hidden complications and motives that were far from simple. And when the forensic autopsy report was completed and delivered, its contents virtually confirmed that Lee was the killer. According to the forensic conclusions, Mo Huan's direct cause of death was drowning, which was consistent with her falling into the sea. However, notably, there were 2 distinct external trauma wounds on her face that could not be explained by falling into water. The first wound was located on the upper eyelid of her right eye, which was severely swollen with subcutaneous tissue showing signs of hemorrhaging and bruising. The second wound was on the inner mucous membrane of her mouth and right cheek, with abrasions and bleeding. The forensic expert concluded that both wounds were caused by strong external force applied to the face. In other words, they resulted from being struck, not from random impact when falling into water. Crucially, surveillance video showed that before Mo Huan and her husband entered the camera's blind spot, her face was completely normal, with no signs of injury or bruising. From this, it could be definitively established that the facial wounds were caused by being beaten during the time the two were in the camera's blind spot, that is, immediately before she fell into the sea. Although police had identified Lee as the prime suspect in the case, formally prosecuting and convicting him would require building a more complete and airtight chain of evidence. To keep Lee from leaving or having the opportunity to destroy evidence, police came up with an excuse. Because they hadn't brought their agency's official seal, issuing the death certificate would require additional processing time, and they asked him to return to Dalian with them to wait for the procedures to be completed. Lee didn't suspect anything and agreed to accompany them. At the same time, the Maritime Transportation Division of the Dalian Public Security Bureau quickly established a special case team to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the case. The investigative force was divided into 4 groups, dispatched in 4 directions to different provinces and cities, including Shanghai, Shandong, Liaoning, and Hubei, to conduct investigative inquiries and gather information about the backgrounds, histories, and relationships of both Lee and Mo Huan. But what left everyone completely stunned was Lee's behavior afterward. It was unclear whether he was so overconfident that he didn't realize police suspected him, or whether he blindly believed police wouldn't be able to uncover anything incriminating. After being set up in a hotel room, Lee brazenly used his phone to call a young woman to come to his room and provide special services. This behavior was directly observed by police surveillance and caught red-handed. It was truly unbelievable. He claimed to be so grief-stricken over his wife's sudden death that he couldn't eat, could only manage to drink a bowl of congee. Yet the moment he turned around, he engaged in such shameful behavior. This kind of hypocrite, playing the role of grieving husband on the outside while being cold and unfeeling on the inside, was truly contemptible. Even more shocking, police discovered that after Lee had officially registered his marriage with Mo Huan, he was secretly dating a college girl who was only 19 years old. This young woman had believed all along that Lee was a single man who had never been married, completely unaware of Mo Huan's existence. She was even planning to marry him after graduating from college. The age gap between them was enormous. Lee was already over 46 while the girl was only 19, which would lead anyone to assume the young woman was attracted to Lee's money and status, and therefore willing to date a man nearly 30 years her senior. But the truth was completely the opposite. Whenever the two went on dates, it was this young woman who paid for everything. It was incomprehensible what methods Lee had used to make her so blinded that she was willing to offer both herself and her money to a man like him. On one occasion, the girl followed Lee home and happened to see Mo Huan also in the house. The girl curiously asked who that woman was. Lee showed no awkwardness whatsoever, calmly explaining that she was just an auntie who worked as a cleaner, no special relationship. The naive young woman didn't think much of it, believed what he said, and didn't question further. However, wouldn't Mo Huan, as the legal wife, have any reaction or concern upon witnessing her husband openly bringing another young woman home like that? Through investigation, the special case team gradually discovered a truth. The marriage between Lee and Mo Huan was entirely an outer shell with no real substance of a normal marriage inside. The apartment where Lee lived had 2 separate bedrooms, and the husband and wife had long been sleeping in separate rooms. Not only the bedrooms, but even their daily necessities were completely separate. Each person used their own things. When investigators observed more closely, they noticed that Lee's bedroom was very clean and tidy, everything neat and orderly. In contrast, Mo Huan's room was messy and cluttered, belongings scattered without any order. This stark difference showed that the two had completely different living habits. When police went to interview the neighbors, they said they had occasionally seen the two coming and going from the apartment, but whenever they climbed the stairs or walked down the hallway, the two always walked single file, one in front and one behind, maintaining a certain distance with no intimate gestures whatsoever. No hand-holding, arm around shoulders, or even simply walking side by side. They looked more like casual acquaintances than a married couple. Employees at Lee's restaurant were also found by police for testimony. All confirmed they had never noticed any intimate relationship between their boss Lee and Mo Huan beyond a normal employer-employee relationship. Mo Huan had come to work at Lee's restaurant in 2016. She was a woman with low education. She couldn't even read, but she was very honest and hardworking, not calculating about things. Meanwhile, Lee was highly educated, a graduate of a prestigious university, and the boss of the entire restaurant, always dressed sharply and elegant, with shrewd and clever manners. When the two stood together, they seemed to belong to 2 completely different social classes. Although some employees had seen Mo-hwan coming and going from Lee's apartment, Lee had deliberately explained to everyone beforehand that the reason was because Mo-hwan was alone in Shanghai with no one to rely on, no relatives at all, and he took pity on her lonely, difficult circumstances and kindly let her stay temporarily in his apartment. Nothing more. All these investigative findings completely contradicted the romantic love story Lee had fabricated to tell police during the initial interrogation. Everything he had described about a happy marriage was lies. Clearly, Lee's registration of marriage with Mo-hwan was not for love, but concealed some completely different scheme. Just as police were actively following leads, an unexpected development occurred. Mo-hwan's son suddenly appeared in Dalian and made a request that police found disadvantageous to the investigation. However, this very request inadvertently exposed a carefully calculated fraud scheme that had long been in the planning. Mo-hwan's son told police that he had reached a private agreement with Lee and had agreed to allow his mother's body to be cremated. When police inquired further about the contents of the agreement, he revealed that the agreement signed by both parties mentioned that while alive, Mo-hwan had purchased a personal accident insurance policy. Lee had promised Mo-hwan's son that after receiving the insurance compensation for this accident, he would share a portion of the payout with him. Additionally, Lee promised to transfer ownership of a car currently registered in his name to him. The moment they received this information, members of the special case team immediately sensed a terrifying possibility. It was very likely that Lee had killed his wife with the intent of insurance fraud to collect the compensation money. Police immediately proceeded to verify information about Mo-hwan's insurance policy. However, upon careful examination of the policy terms and seeing that the coverage amount was only 300,000 won, approximately 41,000 US dollars, they felt something didn't quite add up. This amount, while not insignificant, didn't seem worth the risk of committing murder for someone like Lee. Just as the special case team was deliberating whether Lee had actually committed murder for insurance fraud, Mo-hwan's brother provided another crucial lead that gave the case a breakthrough. Mo-hwan's brother recounted that when he saw police still hadn't issued a death certificate for his sister, while Lee appeared anxious and eager for her to be cremated soon, he himself began to suspect something abnormal was hidden in this case. With these doubts in mind, he directly confronted Lee about the real cause of his sister's death. Lee adamantly insisted it was completely an unfortunate accident, with nothing suspicious. However, what's noteworthy is that during his explanation, Lee proactively mentioned information that no one had asked about. He said he possessed another insurance policy with coverage up to 3 million yuan, approximately 410,000 US dollars, and compensation from this policy could also be given to the Lee family. To show his sincerity, Lee even expressed willingness to immediately mortgage his real estate and give Mo-hwan's son 600,000 won, approximately 82,000 US dollars, as upfront compensation. Lee's voluntary disclosure of this 3 million yuan policy immediately put the special case team on high alert. Following this crucial lead, investigators immediately visited all major insurance companies operating in Shanghai to conduct a comprehensive investigation. After meticulous work, they finally uncovered the truth.
As it turned out, around December 31st, 2020, just about 2 months after registering his marriage with Mo-hwan, Lee had used his wife's identity information to successively purchase a total of 4 personal accident insurance policies with enormous coverage amounts from 3 different insurance companies. Most notably, the beneficiary named in all these policies was Lee himself. According to the policy terms, if Mo-hwan died in an accident while traveling on public transportation such as ships, airplanes, or buses, the maximum total compensation Lee could receive amounted to a staggering 12.3 million yuan, approximately 1.7 million US dollars. This was an enormous sum, more than enough to serve as motive for a premeditated murder. Immediately after confirming this information, the special case team conducted simultaneous searches of Lee's apartment in Shanghai, as well as his parents' home. The search yielded crucial physical evidence. Several of these high-value insurance policies were found hidden under the mattress in Lee's bedroom. At this point in the investigation, everything had become clear. Lee was suspected of killing his wife with the intent of insurance fraud to collect the enormous compensation. The collected evidence was sufficient to proceed with coercive measures. In accordance with legal provisions, police immediately placed Lee under criminal detention for further investigation. Initially, investigators hoped to get Lee to confess through interrogation. However, they quickly realized this was an extremely difficult subject to deal with. Lee appeared to have an extraordinarily stable psychological state, showing no panic or confusion under police's rapid-fire questioning. From beginning to end, he adamantly insisted this was entirely an unfortunate accident and that police were making a wrongful arrest, framing an innocent person. When police presented evidence that he had purchased as many as 4 accident insurance policies with enormous coverage for his wife within a short period, he explained that the reason for buying so much insurance was because his wife was normally hasty and careless in everything she did. He worried about his wife's safety and therefore proactively purchased these accident policies in case the worst happened. However, Lee's defense was riddled with holes that anyone observant could notice. If he truly loved and worried about his wife's health and safety as he claimed, at the very least he should have also purchased critical illness or medical insurance for her in case she became seriously ill. Instead, he had concentrated exclusively on purchasing personal accident insurance, the type that only pays out when the insured dies or is injured in an accident. Police continued to press. If he knew the lifeboat platform was a dangerous area with warning signs prohibiting entry, why had he deliberately taken Muhuan there? Lee quickly deflected, offering the excuse that he wanted to take his wife there so the two could share some intimate moments in a private space. Police didn't give up, pressing even harder. You say you had deep feelings for each other and loved your wife dearly, so why during your entire marriage were you openly having an affair with a 19-year-old college girl? Furthermore, your wife had just died a few days ago, her body not yet cremated. Where did you find the state of mind to call a woman to your hotel room? Is this the behavior of a husband grieving the loss of his wife? Pressed relentlessly to the point where he had nothing left to refute, Lee finally showed signs of flustering. He couldn't offer any reasonable explanation for these glaring contradictions and had to try shifting the topic elsewhere. He began emphasizing that he ran a very successful restaurant business in Shanghai, that his work was going well, and that he wasn't short of money at all. With such economic conditions, he had no reason to risk committing murder just for insurance money. But what Lee didn't know was that police had long seen through his lies. In reality, Lee was not as glamorous as he portrayed himself. As early as 2004 and 2016, he had been criminally prosecuted for theft and credit card fraud. Before Muhuan fell overboard, Lee was already drowning in debt, his life in dire straits. Not only did he regularly owe employees their wages, but he also owed money to multiple suppliers. His own credit cards had been maxed out long ago. He had even used Muhuan's identity information to open a bank account and racked up 100,000 yuan, approximately 14,000 US dollars, in debt. Even the small restaurant he used to project his wealthy image had been fined multiple times by the Market Supervision Administration for environmental violations. Fines combined with previous debts amounted to millions. He had absolutely no ability to pay. For a long period, Lee had been surviving on money Muhuan earned from her work. According to confirmation from one of Muhuan's friends, Lee kept her ID card and phone, preventing her from contacting the outside world. Not only that, Lee had contacted multiple lending companies, wanting to borrow money in Muhuan's name, but failed due to qualification issues. By then, he had reached the end of his rope. Seeing his defenses being torn down one by police, Lee grew increasingly panicked inside. But he still stubbornly maintained his psychological defenses, insisting it was an accident, gambling that the evidence in police hands wasn't sufficient. However, what the case was lacking at this point was direct evidence of his actions. Seeing that interrogation couldn't achieve a decisive breakthrough, police could only return to the scene once more, trying to find new leads. Under the guidance of the local procuratorate, the special case team invited an authoritative forensic analysis organization to conduct a detailed examination of the video footage of Muhuan falling overboard. Experts discovered that before Mu Huan fell into the sea, she had been in a squatting position with both hands braced on the ship's railing when she fell overboard. During the fall, her body showed a distinct rotation. This motion could not have been completed on her own initiative. It was clearly caused by external force pushing her. Additionally, after video enhancement processing, in the instant Mu Huan fell, a black pixel point appeared behind her neck, protruding, then retracting. This was consistent with the black suit Lee had been wearing on the day of the incident. Combined with the earlier forensic report, police deduced Lee's first attempt to push Mo Huan was unsuccessful. When she resisted, he struck her and finally pushed her into the sea from behind. At this point, a complete chain of evidence was formally established. No matter how Lee denied it, he could not overturn the fact that he had killed his wife for insurance fraud. On January 19, 2022, the Dalian Municipal Procuratorate prosecuted Lee for the crimes of intentional homicide and insurance fraud, with particularly severe circumstances requiring combined sentencing for multiple offenses. On July 5th of the same year, the Dalian Intermediate People's Court sentenced Lee to death. Lee subsequently appealed, but the higher court rejected the appeal after review and upheld the original sentence. On June 16, 2025, the Supreme People's Court approved his death sentence. On August 4, 2025, Lee was executed by law, and that is today's case. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.